Hello, everyone. We have a special video today. This is actually going to kick off our free 101 career coaching series. And the first one we're going to be starting off is one that is highly requested. It's like a tech case interview. And we're going to be doing a mock interview with Gerald here. He's been so kind enough to actually allow us to record this. And he also does have an interview coming up. So we're going to be doing it for this particular reason. So today we'll be using a case called the Architecture Strategy Federal Finance Agency. This is from Deloitte. It's also from their website. So the link is down below if you also want to follow along. So how we're going to be doing this is that I will be sending the link to the case itself to Gerald, and then he'll be reviewing the first page. And then there's also like a second page, by the way, with like the key considerations. Then I'll be asking questions, and he can also ask me questions as well to clarify and moving on. So this is also his very first time doing like a real tech case interview as well. So I'll be providing feedback and advice as we go along. It won't be all at the end. We'll finally have like a last feedback session at the end, but it will be a very interactive process. So if you can just like open up the case in the actual chat, right? So you can start reviewing. I'll be giving you a timer, but honestly, most of these are going to be around like 20 to 30 minutes for most of these case interviews, but I'll be giving you around like 5 minutes to review this case. And then after that, you can just stop where it says stop here, and then we'll go from there.
Sure thing. All
okay.
Right. Cool. So taking like initial notes and analyzing it, right? We haven't actually started.
Okay, so before we get started, can you kind of summarize what the case is? Either the business situation, problem statement, what do you think are the key points to focus on in this?
Okay, so to me, the main concern of the business, or actually the business is a federal finance agency. Ultimately, they just want to consolidate their systems. Like that's the big headliner right there.
Yep.
A lot of it needs to improve efficiency. There's a lot of redundant systems. And then the high turnover is spreading a lot of people thin. So especially with the IT department, it makes sense. And then there's 7 different data or systems being used. And so just one IT department being tailored to all 7 of them, it's like, that's a lot on those workers.
Yep.
And then this also leads to a backlog of the paperwork. What does the silo term mean exactly?
Yeah, so silo just means that they're very stuck in what they're doing. They don't really know about anything else that's going on outside of what they're doing.
Okay. Stuck in department, basically. And so basically they don't interact with the other departments, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then in the problem statement, it says that they do want a new shared enterprise solution.
Yep.
So that's across all divisions, which makes sense. Administering and enforcing economic and trade sanctions. So basically, they just make sure people are following the rules, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, as an agency. Okay. And then a big problem I see is to this day that they're still using a lot of hard copies. And a lot of that should be, in my opinion, at least somewhere online in the cloud to access anywhere. I mean, that's basically all I got for the most part.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good. So we can continue on to the actual case itself. So now that we're on at this point, the question I have for you is that your manager has asked you to develop the new architecture plan by analyzing the current systems and interviewing stakeholders. What aspects of the current system would you want to analyze, and how would you gather the information?
So one big thing for me is, let's see, why aren't the departments talking to each other on one database? Everything needs to connect and communicate that way. People aren't uploading redundant information. That's one. And then 2, I would say, what's the cause of this high turnover?
Okay.
We need to get to the root cause of that. And then, let's see. And then along with that, actually, the hard copies, I would say, is a third big point for me personally, just because in this day and age, most things should be electronic by now. It allows easy access from anywhere, and the cloud just being one of those big things these days that companies utilize. Yeah.
Okay. So I have some feedback on this. The first thing is that I'm noticing you have answers, and then after that, you're still thinking of the other answers. So a better way to approach this is that you figure out your entire answer before you approach it. You want to make sure everything is coherent, almost like you're giving a little speech. Otherwise, if it seems like you're in between answers, it doesn't necessarily seem the most clear. Part of the actual case interview is to be very clear and logical with how you answer. So this is also going to be a part of the case. It's not necessarily just the answer itself, it's also how you deliver it.
Okay.
Mhm. And one other thing was that the question also asked, how would you gather the information? You only really talked about what aspects of the current system would you want to analyze, or also like what are the other outside of the system, like business problems that you would want to also analyze. So there's also that one part of the question that you didn't really answer. So if you want to in the future, you could actually just kind of take a step back, write down exactly what the question is, and or while I give you the question, you can take notes of what the question is, because I think like as people get questions, they just kind of forget about it and they just only either clinch onto like the first part of the question or the last part of the question, but they don't get the whole question. And when it comes to case interviews, a lot of them are going to be like a pretty full question where it can be asking you multiple parts.
Oh, I see. Okay. So as far as gathering the information, um, I honestly would not. I don't know exactly what that question entails because
Okay.
this whole world's new to me. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'm going to just reread the question and break it down a little bit. Your manager has asked you to develop a new architecture plan by analyzing current systems and interviewing stakeholders. What aspects of the current system would you want to analyze? So in this case, out of the legacy systems, the in-house solutions that they have, what would you want to analyze from them? And how would you gather the information? So this could be like when you're interviewing the stakeholders in the first part of the question, how would you want to gather that information? What kind of questions or requirements or priorities would you want to ask from them? And also, what are you wanting to look from the actual system? So it's like asking for the people aspect and the tech aspect.
Okay.
Mhm.
So basically, the answers were just given in a sense, right?
They're kind of giving you a framework of some sort. So there is the people, process, and technology framework out there. So
Mhm.
that is a good way to kind of frame a lot of whenever it comes to technology consulting case interviews. So knowing that there's different ways you can respond to it, the best way is the one where you hit all the points.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Mhm. So you can give an answer again if you want to do it again.
Okay.
Okay.
Uh, so just start all over.
Yep.
Okay.
To this question. Yep.
Okay. So the three main points I'd like to focus on are the cause of the high turnover rate in the company. Obviously, something's affecting the workers. And then two, why the company is using 7 different systems
Mhm.
instead of just one, or at least communicating with each other, even if there are multiple systems. And then three, why are hard copies of cases and licenses still being used in this day and age, especially with technology the way it is now? And how to gather this info could just be going about through interviews, asking the key stakeholders or the people of higher positions what their take on their processes and people are, and two, to analyze their current systems. So obviously, the client needs a new system, and it's important to learn from these legacy or older systems. And then three, the processes. So what's being done right now in, for example, uh, form reporting and processing, and how exactly is that done, and then how are the people and technology integrated into that?
Okay. So some feedback on that is that first off, you led off talking about the actual turnover rate. To be honest, that's not that important in this particular question because the whole point is to really analyze the current system and interviewing the stakeholders. So like if we wanted a system that solved the turnover rate, yes, that would be a really good valid question to ask, but this is specifically talking about consolidating them. The
Okay.
other one would be when you said that why are there 7 different systems, and this is actually the business situation. You don't need to kind of ask about the business situation unless it's actually helpful to the actual case. But in this case, all they care about is consolidating, because in the end of the day, let's say, for example, you are a law firm, you have 5 different systems, like one at the desk and one to actually schedule appointments and one to like have calls. Like that is something as a reason why they'd have multiple systems. But depending on the actual firm or the consult, or not the consulting firm, the client, they have different reasons. But the whole point of it is like, how can we make this all cohesive together? They're not really trying to debate the point of like, why is it together? Why is it separate? I think a better way to really approach this question is, what are you looking for? And then what kind of questions do you need to ask to find what you need? So if you're asking about like, why is there a high turnover rate? Unless the question or the case is asking for something specifically about the turnover rate, then it makes sense to ask the question. So everything is supposed to be targeted towards the solution of the actual case, rather than just asking question for the actual background information. You could ask that in the very beginning, but in this particular question, they're asking about what should we be looking for when analyzing current systems and interviewing stakeholders. So some examples could be like aligning the business processes. So kind of similar to what you mentioned about being siloed. So instead of asking like, why are they siloed or how are they siloed? It's really more about, let's try to analyze how we can align them all. So that way they're not siloed, they're kind of all in sync. And the other one could be like analyzing data issues in the database of like, why there are redundancies and what are the issues from that. So that way you can take that in consideration when you do build the new system. So in this case, they have a good answer, and that's a great answer. So the one that I just said is a good answer. A great answer would include analyzing current business processes by identifying key use cases. So this is something that's going to be very prevalent in consulting. You want to make sure you have use case for everything. You don't want to build something or develop something and there's like no use case for it. You just wasted time and energy. And then there's also created data mapping to see how the information is being recorded in different multiple systems. So whenever there's actual like multiple systems and you have to kind of collaborate to see they're all on the same page, data mapping or data model, anything like that is very key to make sure that you have the right inputs and outputs and they do talk to each other. It's not something that we expect a lot of people who are doing these case interviews to understand, but it is what makes a good answer great.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yep. So do you have any questions about this before we move on?
What do you mean by use case?
Yeah, so use case is like, let's say, for example, McDonald's. Why would you need a wrapper around the burger? Well, the use case would be people want to take it on the go. You need to have an actual purpose for it, an actual reason that it's actually important. Otherwise, if it's like, oh, I could just take the burger and go and it's no problem. But then people want to take it into their cars and want to take it to somewhere else. Like those are the ones that you start to see, why is it important? And whenever it comes to interviewing stakeholders, you want to know, like, is there an actual use case for it? Is in like you need it rather than you want it. You always want to see like the priorities from there and what is the priority from which requirements you want to prioritize, and then which ones are like, if we have time and money, we can do those.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, I'm good.
Perfect. And then I can go a little bit more into the actual frameworks a little bit later on. I don't know if you have time to look at it, but there was like the people, the process, and the technology. And then there's also the big little chart that I built as well. It's really good to kind of keep those in mind while you're doing the case. So that way you can keep in mind of the actual industry, the client, and then the technology of it. So that way it's not just like whenever I give a question, regardless of the case, it would be the same answer. It should be slightly tailored towards the actual client based off of like the nature of their business or maybe like the kind of ask that they're asking for and the problems.
Okay, so I actually wanted to ask you about that because I made like a little template in a sense based off your framework. So with industry, you just focus on the industry they're in. So in this case, it would be economic and trade sanctions, right?
Technically, this would be government.
Government, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then the problem actually lists a couple of, or it just says that recent rules and regulations have changed and affected them. So that would be like a good thing to focus on possibly.
If it does end up like asking a question about like how a project can like have an impact on it, or maybe some considerations to look into, But as the questions come up, if it's relevant to that question, then you can talk about it. If you just want to preemptively mention it, as long as you can tie it into the question or to the answer, then that's good.
Okay, I see.
Yep.
And then you said the high turnover rate isn't exactly something to focus on, but it's something to take into consideration.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. If it's like maybe like yep, go on.
Focus more on consolidating the systems first.
Yeah. So the problem statement should be the one you focus on, and then all the other things is what you consider. So, for example, I mean, I don't want to give the answer away, but let's say, for example, training, or maybe like knowing how to use the technology. If there's a higher turnover rate, you have to constantly train. So you may want to build some assets. So that way, when you do have like someone new coming on, they know how to use the system. Because one thing you do notice in the key considerations is that there's like people that are not necessarily the best with technology there. So that is something to consider, but it's not something to focus on of like, why is there high turnover rate? That's more of like a management consulting role. But whenever it comes to technology, it's more of like all those management consulting, those macro elements are things to consider, but it's not the driving force of the actual solution.
I see. Okay.
Unless it's directly related.
And then for the technology, it's just asking about what do they use right now, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can talk about like what do they use right now, what are some current things that they value, or what are some like things that they want to do in the future, because even though like this is the technology they have now, they're trying to use this as a way to kind of transform their technology or their systems. And then that's what you can take in consideration to build their future use.
Okay. And when you say contingency plans for risks, what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so let's say, for example, the high turnover rate, that is technically a risk itself. So maybe people who are misusing the system, or when they are putting in input and data, it's not the right data just because they're not trained for it. That is also risk. So you may want to introduce training or assets or guides or aids or anything like that. Another thing could be like if you were trying to put in clean data, which is how it starts in the very beginning, and then you start putting in bad data, then you're like, you need to redo the whole thing again, or at least clean it up. So that is like an example of a risk. Another one could be like cutting funding. Then now like you may have to focus more on like a minimum viable product, or you maybe like a risk could be like the key stakeholders, like maybe they left the firm or left the company. So that is something to also consider. These are just like speculations of like in the future, if you do have cases where it's about that. Another one could be like, let's say, for example, contractors. They're not technically employees of the company, but you may have them as a potential breach of security. So that is something to also consider. It's like all these tiny little things. They're not expecting you to learn this in school. They're not expecting you to know about like all these potential things. They just want you to know about like, think about all the connections that it could potentially have, and mostly the risk and the practicality.
So these risks apply to the legacy process and systems that they have,
yes.
not the people.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, awesome. All right, I think I'm good.
Okay. So the next question is, and tell me when you're ready.
I am ready.
Okay. The scope of the project is potentially very large given the consolidation of software systems, data structures, and potential new development efforts. How would you prioritize the list of requirements for the new system?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yep. The scope of the project is potentially very large given the consolidation of software systems, data structures, and potential new development efforts. How would you prioritize the list of requirements for the new system?
Mind if I take a moment?
Yep.
Okay, I am ready. Okay, so first I would get an initial analysis of the current systems and processes, talk to all the key important people. What exactly do they do? What do they not communicate to other people? And then combine all that into one database, right? Combine all 7 and see how exactly the database works with all the departments working together. And then 3, it would just to get feedback on any problems on the new system, and then improve from there.
Okay, so you have basically described gathering the requirements. Now, how do you actually prioritize those requirements? Which ones to prioritize, which ones not to? Like, how do you tell the difference between wants and needs?
How do I tell the difference between wants and needs? So after talking to all the key stakeholders, for example, just to see what's required for everyday functions. What are the essential job necessities that they need in this new system to work right off the bat,
Mhm.
and work on the smaller problems after that. Let's just say managing your user account on the system. That's a little less important than having to process an actual form or case. And then once, it would also be good to hear about the everyday users,
Okay.
below the managers, just to see what they do in and out every day that a manager may not do. Hearing feedback on what can you improve on the new, uh, or what do you want to see on this new system, and taking those into consideration as well, and seeing if it's essential or it's secondary.
That's good. All right, so what we would be looking for is that we want you to rank and weight the requirements based off of an objective methodology. So this is where people can get very emotional or personally involved in this because they're like, oh, we need this, but really you don't need this. You just want this to make your life a little bit easier. So that's why it's very important to rank it by needs and wants. And then after that, but what you mentioned that is actually a really key point is that you went to the end users and say, what was something you needed? Because managers are kind of a little bit more up there. Like key stakeholders are not always the ones that are using the system. Maybe there are other things to keep in mind. But even with that, you still want to keep in consideration which ones are the needs and which ones are the wants. Maybe whatever the users are saying is like, so maybe they just like didn't do it properly. And then the whole time the key staker was right. So that communication is good. Another thing is that we also need to make sure to track it. While we're doing this implementation, are we actually on track, or are we going to be doing a lot of things that people don't actually care about and doesn't address the main issue? So that is one. So for example, when we're consolidating all these systems, if we maybe wanted to make sure security is there so that way people can access what they want to access, that's a need. Meanwhile, there could be like a want of like, here, we want this random report that only one stakeholder uses just for the sake of profitability. It is not a need, it is a want. But if it's like required for maybe reporting purposes or tax purposes or anything like that, that's a need. So that is a good way to kind of see like, does it actually solve a problem, or is it just something that will help you solve the problem? So that's a good way to kind of prioritize. Another thing, which is like a pretty key thing in consulting, is that you always want the key stakeholders to actually approve the list of requirements. You don't want to act on these requirements and then they're just like, oh, we never asked for this. Like, why are you working on this? We are paying you X number of dollars to be working on something we don't actually want. So it's always good to have them to sign off on requirements as well to make sure it is exactly what they want. And that way we're not going to get in trouble for working on it.
Oh, okay, because ultimately those stakeholders have the ultimate say.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
By the way, in this particular case, they gave me A, B, and C, and you have to tell me which ones are all of the above. But just to make it a little bit more interesting, I just asked you point blank.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Did I at least get one of them?
Yeah, you got two of them.
Oh, sick. All right.
Yeah,
Cool.
and you actually added one that wasn't even on there, so that's even better.
Awesome.
A lot of these are just like, here's a good answer, here's a great answer, but they're not all inclusive. Like this is where the actual interviewer comes in and provides their own ideas of like what's a good and what's a great answer. So a lot of this is also kind of objective. So one of the reasons why I like to kind of research who the interviewer is for this particular reason.
Okay.
All right, so when you're ready, we have our last question. Actually,
ready.
two last questions. All right, so this is kind of similar across the question that you asked me before is, what factors out of Deloitte's control will determine the scope of the project?
Can you reword that question?
Yep.
Yeah.
So what are some things to consider to make sure that Deloitte is successful in this project? Some potential risks.
Let's see.
And feel free to resort to your notes or the case that's provided through the link.
Okay, I'm just going to take an attempt because, yeah. So to me, it would just make sure the consultant takes into account of everything, talks to all the important people needed, and it's not just about the higher up view, it's the ground view as well. So talking to those people under the managers, but to also not get too lost in the details. Make sure the overall goal is to consolidate this database. Maybe it's contributing to the high turnover rate, but ultimately it's just to make the process a lot easier. And then, yeah, that's honestly all I could come up with.
Okay. All right. So this one is very in line with the project management triangle of money, time, and resources, or scope in this case. So this is something where, like, let's say, for example, they cut in budget. Now we have a lot less time to work with, or we just have a lot fewer resources to work with to make this happen. Another one could be maybe they cut the timeline, or like now instead of 2 years, you get 1 year. There's not much time to work on it. You may have to kind of forego a lot of the required features. The other one could be maybe resources. Like I mentioned, like maybe people have left the firm, or maybe people have left the client. In this case, like you may have to kind of work with that turnover rate and see like, okay, we may need to regather all this energy and requirements and make sure people are okay to test it. A great answer is the ones that actually require all of the macro elements. So when I mention anything about like maybe US foreign policy, or maybe anything about the actual government, because at the end of the day, this is a federal agency, that is something that may actually make an impact on this. And another one is the actual agency's availability of resources. So maybe if like even you do have all the time and the resources, maybe they just don't have them available for like these meetings or to actually do the documentation of all of this. Like at the end of the day, it's like both people. It's not necessarily just the client that's doing all the work. You also do need the client's engagement as well to make sure that like at least like you're building a product or service that is what they're looking for.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So mostly it's always about time, resources, and budget. And then you also need to always go above that and say like, oh, the macro elements of it. So an example could be like maybe the technology in a case would be self-driving cars. Well, there could be a macro element of, well, what if there's a law or regulation about self-driving cars? Now the solution is kind of put, you need to figure out a contingency plan on it.
So in regards to the question you asked me with Deloitte's control,
Yep.
how would those three, time, money, and resources, it's still kind of unclear to me, sorry.
Yeah, these are all out. Like the question is asking, I'm just going to read it out again. What factors out of Deloitte's control will determine the scope of the project? So this is not something that Deloitte can control, maybe the client control, but the question was not asking about that. It was asking about outside of Deloitte's control. It could be the client, it could be the climate, the industry, the actual world itself. There's so many factors that can come into this. What are the potential factors of that into the actual project? Do you get it now?
Out. No, I'm sorry. You said out.
Yeah.
Out.
Oh, okay.
My bad. Sorry about that.
No problem. But it's good that you asked to rephrase it, but this is that's a good way of like, can you repeat it, but then not want to sound like you didn't know it.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Well,
And
now you
one
know.
more question?
Yep, there's one more question. So this one, it's going to be a pretty long one, actually. So let me know when you're ready.
Good.
All right. After your current state analysis, it has been determined that the client's biggest pain point is the amount of time it takes to enter data into each system, and this could be improved by creating a unified data architecture to be used across all the systems. What steps would you go through to implement this new database? What do each of these steps entail?
Okay. Do you mind if I have a moment?
Yep.
Okay. I am ready.
All right.
Okay. So just to make sure, the big concern is the amount of time data entered. And what they want to do is to consolidate. And they just want to know the steps to create this new database and how, what exactly those steps entail. Okay.
Yep.
So number one, I'd first analyze. So we'd interview everyone, like I said before, and it'd be the first initial interview. So it'd be kind of long in terms of just getting to know what the system currently does. It's about what everything it's used for. So after that, we see the over-the-shoulder usage. So we go up to someone that uses it every day, see what's needed, what's not needed, and what interacts with what. Because in the end, we're gonna have to use like ERDs and all that. And to see what are the primary keys and all that. So two, consult. So we consult with the needed teams. So we get with the developer teams or any other necessary teams that are needed to build this new database. And we get the best direction and approach from them. And 3, we present the plan to the key stakeholders and possibly also any other person or a standard employee, regular employee, just to see how they like the direction that we're pointing at right now. And we receive feedback. We take all that into account and we go on to step 4 where we build, where we have the developer team and any other teams build the actual database. And we take into account all those ideas and feedback. 5, we implement. So basically we just implement the system to use just as a practice run though, not company-wide, but just like on a smaller scope to see how it functions. And then we receive feedback from those people that are in that limited scope. And then when it's deemed worthy enough to implement company-wide, then we implement company-wide and receive further feedback from there.
I would say your answer was really good in this one. You covered almost all of the points. You went through identifying the requirements, designing, building, training. In this case, like you did not really touch that part, but you talked about testing without using the word testing. So testing is very important because after you basically went through the whole SDLC, but you did not really talk about testing that much. You did talk about, which I really liked about here. Let's start with this little small area and then see, do people accept it? Do people like it before you deploy it? In that case, like I would consider that almost like you're testing, but you did not really mention about all the types of testing. So you want to make sure that does the system work? Is there like user acceptance testing? Like, do they actually like it? And then all those kind of things. And what you did, like the big structure, that actually is good. One thing that you did not mention really is training. So like I mentioned about the people, process, and technology, you did mention about like, okay, yeah, maybe the stakeholders like it. And then you want to make sure, do they accept it from the little minimal viable product that you have? But you did not really mention training because like we mentioned in the actual key considerations was that over there, they said, you know, not everyone is pretty good with technology. You have a lot of lawyers and ex-military officers. So this is where you bring it back to the case and try to look into it and see, okay, what are some considerations we're going to need to consider? So this is, for example, a key risk. So one could be like training. Maybe they're just not really good with technology. And if they don't like technology, they're just going to be like, well, this is a new system. I'm not going to try it. So you always want to make sure you provide that training aspect, or you want to make sure that they feel comfortable with it. Or and the good thing is that you wanted to do something where you get them involved too. So it does get that involvement, and in some cases will involve them to train themselves that way. But a really key point is really training and testing in your answer. But I really liked the way you approached it. You first, and I can see throughout the progression of today, you've actually gone better. At first you like jumped in with your answer, and now you're like actually like confirming the question first before you gave me like your actual progression of your list, which is a very logical way of saying it. So I think I would applaud you. This is probably your best answer yet, in addition to just including the word testing and then a mention of training.
Okay, awesome. Well,
yeah.
To be honest, what helped with it was I'm going through a database management class right now. So it's a 2-semester long project where we had to reach out to a local company and then just offer them hey, we'll improve your database or make a new one. And so that's what we've been doing. And we're actually in the middle of developing the GUI for it right now.
That's great. And when you mentioned about the ERD, I was like, oh, good thing, because like that was actually what made a good answer great, in addition to all the additional things I mentioned.
Okay. Okay, hopefully I get something similar.
Yeah, yours might be a little bit more related to cybersecurity. So I would kind of touch up a little bit more on the topic of cybersecurity. You may or may not get a topic on it specifically, just maybe something in technology. But overall, I think you're getting the sense of how to conduct yourself in a case interview, like the way you communicate yourself, the way you want to clarify the question before you jump into conclusions. And then also just like the actual kind of questions and answers that you'll expect is more focused on people, process, technology. That's like generally the most used framework when it comes to technology consulting. And then the framework that I provided is also a good thing to consider while you're kind of like planning the entire thing out for the grand scheme of things.
Do you abide by your framework, like kind of verbatim in a sense, like you go boom, boom, boom?
I don't really just like, here, I'm going to draw the framework before I even start this case and write down for a little bit things here and there. It's just like a good thing to keep in consideration. So it's more like a reminder than it is like an actual worksheet of anything. So when I get a question, and this is actually something I do on a typical day basis, like the good thing about technology consultant case interviews is that they're very similar to how you would get it in real life. The only difference is that you're not getting like a paper or pencil, or you're not saying it, you're doing it.
Yeah.
So the difference is like, well, maybe if there's like an industry out there you need to take in consideration, maybe it's like particular businesses that like whatever they're doing that is very specific to the technology solution that we need to consider. And then the actual technology itself, like, is this something that would work for them? And then what are the project, the whole triangle there is like the budget, and you have your time and scope. That's also something you need to take in consideration. It's not, the thing about technology is that it's very focused on the actual implementation, the practicality, the risk, that all the execution itself. A lot of the management consultant case interviews, they focus on strategy. Here's like a theory, it may or may not work. We'll leave that to the technology consultants to do. But then that's where we have to deal with what is actually doable. We have to like, we can't do everything. We have to kind of give up some features, like do something, make in consideration of this. We're the ones that tell them what they should be considering, rather than here's our recommendation, because they have to take it, or if they don't take it, then there will be some consequences down the line.
I see.
Mhm.
Okay. And I just had two questions regarding like
Yep.
just general
Go
virtual
for it.
interviewing. Or actually, first one, with technology, do I expect to do any calculations, or that's more management?
You should not be doing calculations. If you do them, it's like very basic.
Okay. But like they're not going to ask me like what's our revenue or projected something like.
They shouldn't be, but it really does depend on, again, like if you know who your interviewer is, I would research them. If they are coming from like a more technical background, you'll probably get a case that we just got today. If they're coming from a management consulting background, they may go into more about like, oh, what is the ROI if we did this solution kind of thing. And you may have to kind of back it up with all the things that we talked about today, but just back it up with those reasons. You don't need to give an exact number, but it's just things to consider.
Okay. And
Mhm.
then virtual interviewing,
Yeah.
should I have looked more directly at the camera?
Yeah, I noticed that during the case, you were just looking at your paper. You weren't really looking at the webcam itself. So it is okay. The way I like to do it is I always position Zoom to have like the person directly under the webcam. So as if I'm looking at them, I'm looking at the webcam kind of. But that is like something that's good to do. So what I like to do on case interviews is that I would be doing the case interview, do my own thing. And then when I'm actually trying to like either clarify a question or say my solution, I would look at them. And then if I need to look back, I would, but I wouldn't be looking at this the whole time.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can also say something as like, oh, let me refer back to my notes. And then it'll be like, oh, you're not necessarily being rude of anything.
I see. All right.
Mhm.
And then should I have like the iPad more visible? Like just
Oh, I didn't care about that.
okay.
If you are actually, a good thing to do about case interviews in light of this is that you could technically draw diagrams if you want to. Maybe like, for example, the design, then you have the build, test, and then deploy. For that, you can draw a diagram and you can show it to the camera. That is something you can do too. Or the other thing could be that you just screen share as well, if you have that capability to actually draw it on your computer.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Mhm.
And so do you have anything else? Like, are you going to move on to something? Or you
Oh,
have something?
that's the last question.
Okay. Well, I do have a question for you. What would have
Yep.
what would have been your chosen buckets for this case interview?
What do you mean by buckets?
Like your main points.
Okay, yeah. Let me pull up the case again. So what I would be focusing a little bit more on is when I mentioned about the people, process, and technology, I would mostly focus on the people and process. Technology, this could be like an ERP system. One thing that we could mention though is you mentioned actually in the very beginning about like, oh, like there's a lot of like paper lying around. This could be a good opportunity to also consider cloud. So when you have 7 systems and you're consolidating them, one good thing to use is probably cloud. Otherwise, you're kind of using like 7 systems on premise. So
Yeah.
that is something to consider. So what they're looking for is like, here's your answer, but you can also put in your own spin of creativity. So like, oh, we can include cloud, and you can also put in your own little spin of like, oh, I have experience working with databases due to my class that you're taking right now. And then you can also provide some additional points to consider. So like when you mentioned the primary key, I was like, oh, that's a good thing, because you're not necessarily focusing on the technical part, but you're kind of showing that you have some kind of understanding to it. So in this, I would talk about more about the considerations of consolidating from multiple data systems. And then a recommendation on it would be maybe going to the cloud. And then another thing could be more about the actual training aspect of it. So we keep on getting information about high turnover rates, or maybe people just don't know how to use technology. That clearly shows there's some kind of point to focus on there as well. It's the training aspect. And especially being in like a federal agency, they're not necessarily the most tech savvy as well. So maybe something in security is also good too.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. So really like a good way to learn about all of this and just having an eye for this is, other than like working in the industry about this, is really looking at all the current events. What are the things that people of these particular industries are doing, or maybe what are they valuing? So maybe like what you'll hear about all these security breaches, like why are there security breaches? What are they doing about it? And then anything about like data, like how are they doing it? And then really learning about all these tech concepts, like what is cloud, to be able to even propose this idea. Because when I did my case interview, they actually had a very similar case to this, where they said, we have all these systems, it's actually a higher education client. And then I was like, well, you can use cloud, and then that way you don't have to worry about all these different legacy systems. You just put them all in one, and then it will be able to be used all across campus. And another thing I mentioned was the actual nature of being a higher education client, is that maybe they're also not as tech savvy, and maybe they're older. So that is also something to bring in training. Honestly, training is like always something I like to bring in. Who doesn't need training? It's like there's always going to be older people in here, and always there's going to be people that are also resistant to change. So that's also something to bring up as well.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That actually fits in line with one of the notes I took a while back. Someone said that if it's not efficient enough, focus on interaction of people and process, and
Yeah.
see what might be failing to scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then task not being done fast enough, focus on interaction of process and tech and automation more.
Yes, exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and a lot of it could be right. It's just a matter of the actual backing that you provide, because a lot of this is just a framework. So whatever you say to the interviewer, as long as the interviewer thinks it's a good answer, or maybe it makes sense, then they will just say, yeah, you're good, because they're not trying to fit you into a box where you have to check these answers off to be able to pass the interview.
I see. And so what you did today with the questions, would that be what I should probably expect from the interview?
You could. There's two different types of case interviews. One is the interviewee led, where they just give you the case and they just sit there, and they're expecting you to provide the whole solution based off of the actual case. The other one is interviewer led, which is the one we just had, where we give questions and you answer off of the case. So there could be two different ways. Whenever it comes to, like, I think it was McKinsey and Accenture, they're more focused on interviewee led, and everything else is more focused on interviewer led. So knowing that the particular firm that you're interviewing for may potentially be doing the one that we just did today.
I see. Okay. Awesome. Well, this was a good learning experience. Thank you very much.
No problem. And good luck with your interview.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. And if you have any other questions, you can leave down a comment. And if you're interested in doing one of these also career coaching 101s, leave a comment down below, and also check out the form we have in the description, so you can also apply for that. Thank you so much, Gerald.
Thank you, Christine. Have a good one. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.